Welcome to Live DAF, your online DAF Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem, welcome back to today's DAF, KIDDUSHIN DAF Yud Ches. We got up to the 2 dots, which are 10 lines off the top of the Amud. Tanu Rabbanan, we begin with a brisa. Yesh be'ivri, there are some things that apply to an Eved Ivri, so it's a Jewish male servant. She'ein be'ivriya, which do not apply to an Amma ha'ivriya, a Jewish maidservant. So some things apply to the Eved Ivri and not to the Amma ha'ivriya. V'yesh be'ivriya, she'ein be'ivri. And some apply to the Amma ha'ivriya, but do not apply to an Eved Ivri. Explains the brisa. Yesh be'ivri. The following apply to the Eved Ivri only. Shehu yotze b'shanim. He departs, he goes free, once his 6 years are up. Ube yovel, or if yovel arrives. Ube misas ha'adain, or if his master passes away. Masha ein kain, be'ivriya, which do not apply to an Amma ha'ivriya, which obviously sounds pretty startling and will be explained in a minute. So these 3 forms of departure, shanim, yovel, and misas ha'adain, are strictly applicable to an Eved Ivri. And likewise, v'yesh be'ivriya, and what applies exclusively to the Amma ha'ivriya, sheharei ivriya yotze b'simanin. She leaves his control when she becomes an adult, something which is inapplicable to an Eved Ivri. What else? Ve'enon imkeres v'nishnis. You can't resell her, meaning a father has a right to sell his daughter once, but once she comes back home, he can't sell her again. Umaftan oisa ba'al karchai, and we can actually forcibly generate this bailout to redeem her from her master. Masha'inkin be'ivri, all these do not apply to the male slave, the Eved Ivri. Amamar, let's go back and review the entire brisa. Yesh be'ivri, she'ein be'ivriya. So all these methods of departure, shanim, yovel, and misas ha'adain, are exclusive to the Eved Ivri and do not apply to her. Really? V'raminhi. Remember that Mishnah back on the Yud Daled, which tells us that the Eved Ivri leaves, whether his years are up, whether the yovel, etc., and the Amma ha'ivriya has an additional avenue of freedom. V'raminhi yesera alav Amma ha'ivriya. So on top of all those forms of departure, the Amma has an additional method, shekoina atzma b'simanin, because once she gets simani gadlus, she exhibits adulthood, she's free. But of course, in addition to the other options of freedom. And here we say that they only apply to the Eved. Amar avsheshes. Typically, of course, an Amma will leave due to the shanim, yovel, etc. But here we're speaking Amar avsheshes kegoin sheyad. We know that the owner of the Amma ha'ivriya can actually proceed and marry her. Yiyud, right? As the Torah provides, Yiyud is an option for the Amma ha'ivriya, and that's what happened. Kegon shiyada, he already married her, and therefore she cannot just leave. She needs a get. She's like his wife. Asks the Gemara, what do you mean? Yada pshita. Of course, it's pretty obvious that once Yiyud was performed, Gita baya. She wants to leave. She needs a get. She's a married woman. Well, Ma'odatema, perhaps I would say. Loy levatla. Hilcha samina. Despite the fact that they proceeded with Yiyud, perhaps she still retains some of her original identity. She's still somewhat treated like an Amma ha'ivriya, in which case, when she reaches, yovel, etc., she leaves. Kamash malano. Once Yiyud was done, we treat it like a standard marriage, and the only way to leave is through a get. Well, says the Gemara, Ihachi, if that's the case, Amai Yoitza b'simanin. But the Brisa does give her the simanin option, which obviously cannot work if she's really married. Hachi Amar, the Brisa is sort of switching tracks now. Im lo yada. No, if there was no Yiyud done and she was still an ordinary shivcha, Yoitza af b'simanin, then she can leave. She can go free by either reaching the 6-year max, yovel misas ha'adain, or she has an additional route to freedom, which is simanim. So bottom line is, the Brisa is addressing two scenarios. We start with the way an Eved Ivri goes out, Shanim, Yovel Misas Adain, as opposed to an Ivriya who already underwent Yiyud, in which case the only option is get. And then we proceed to an ordinary Ivriya, a standard Amma, a pre-Yiyud Amma, who has all those aforementioned options in addition to Simanin. Ve'enan imkeres v'nishnis. You cannot sell your daughter and then resell her again. That's specific to the Amma. But an Eved Ivri, repetitive selling can work. Mechlal Eved Ivri nimka v'nishna. Do you mean to say that you sell an Eved and sell him again? V'atanya, but the Brisa says, Bignei Vase, v'nimkar Bignei Vase. So the Eved robbed a bank. Bezdin will now sell him as a slave and use the sale money to compensate the victim. Bignei Vase, only to pay up for his robbery, but not to pay for the double payment. So let's say he has enough of his own money to pay up for the actual, principal amount of his robbery, but he doesn't have for the kefil, which is the additional, double payment penalty that we tack on, right, when one steals. He doesn't have enough to pay that back. We don't sell him to pay for the kefil. The pasuk says, "Bignei vasei v'loy bezmamai." Only if it's in order to facilitate the actual repayment of his robbery, but not in a case where he was an aid zoimim, which means that he was an aid. He testified that, falsely testified that somebody stole something. So he intended on inflicting financial damage on that fellow. It turns out that he was falsifying it, and it was proven that he was in a different location at that during that alleged crime that was committed at this location. So he was an eid zoimim. He was a plotter. Zoimim means to plot. In which case now the penalty which would have been applied against that person is now turned around and applied against him. So in order to repay, to fulfill that einish, that penalty, does he have to go through a mechira process? Let's say he doesn't have enough to pay for that. No, we don't sell him for that. Bignei vase v'lo bezmami. Bignei vase also teaches us kivan shenimkar hamachas. Once he was sold as a slave one time, shuv i'ata rashoy l'moichra. You can't sell him again. And here we say that we could. Amar Rav Lekash. It depends on the circumstance. Kam bignei v'achas. You cannot sell him twice to repay one robbery. So let's say, he stole $1 million and he's only worth $500,000. We sold him once, so we got the half. When he's done that term, you can't resell him again for the rest. Kan b'shtei gneivos. But when we say that it is legal to resell him again, it's speaking about two different episodes. We allow to sell him again if it's for the point of repaying for another robbery. Amalei Abaye, bignei vasei tuva mashma. Why? Why can't you? No, Abaye has a kasha. Says v'ninka bignei vasei. Bignei vasei can mean many, can mean plural, right? Because even though bignei vasei sounds like it's describing a single episode, we do find, Rashi brings some examples, we find that even a lashon yachid can be alluding to, the general concept. Many of that, single entity. Rashi brings some examples here, around 20-25 lines off the top of the Amud. Rashi says, Tuva mashma, im abad al shtein b'din echad, kulon karina bebignei vasai, k'dechsiva behema rabba, right? Ubehema rabba. Many behemoths, but we refer to them as behema. Behema rabba is the concept, is the class of animals. V'hadaga shabayir, right, by the makas dam, the fish in the Nile. We don't say dagim, daga. It's the sort of the category. So even though it's lashon yachid, but it's a reference to the entire entity. with all its plurality. So Abai is asking on Rava like this: you're telling me that Bigneva Achas, if it's in order to compensate for one robbery, and you can't sell them twice, even if you're not going to get enough from every from the first sale. It's a one-time deal, one opportunity. But if you rob somebody twice, right, you can sell them once and again. So Abai asks a kasha, what do you mean Bignei Vasai is really referring to all these episodes? And the Torah is telling us that you can only sell them once. Ela Rabbi Lekasha. The answer is like this: it depends on how many victims we're dealing with. Kan ba adam echad, kan b'shnei bnei adam. If it's one victim, right, and even though he's dealing with two robberies, but he's bringing him to Bezdin one time and addressing both robberies, but it's the same victim. Here you can only sell him once, even though the money received in exchange for his an account of that sale won't provide for the full amount. You have one opportunity to sell him, but if it's two people involved, two victims, or as Rashi explains, even if it's the same victim, but he robbed him, he sold him, then he robbed him again. So it's like a totally new episode, unrelated to the first one, unlinked to that first robbery and that first sale. You deal with it separately, and of course you can resell him again to repay for that second episode. Okay, so bottom line is, whether you're an Evet Ivri or Amma Ivriya, you have many options. You have the Shanim, Yovel, Misa Sa'ada, and all these will set you free. Amma Ivriya has an additional route, which is Simanan once she turns an adult. She has a couple more advantages. You will not sell her and resell her. And the Gemara explained that typically even an Evet Ivri cannot be resold. Cannot be sold twice. And according to Abaye, what it means to say is that you can't, sell him once and again for the same, within the same, verdict, so to speak. You can't bring him to the Bezdin and cause him to be sold and resold again on account of one judgment. But of course, if there are separate episodes, then you can do that. You can sell and sell again as per need. Whereas by the Amma Hivriya, it's a one-time opportunity. Father can sell her once, and that's it. His privilege expires. One more thing, we said that the Amma Ivriya, maftin oisa ba'al karchay. So we force him to cooperate in terms of bailing her out. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, but first let's conclude regarding selling the Eved v'nimkar b'gneva tanu rabbanan. Gneva elef. Suppose he robbed 1,000. V'shava chamish me'os, and he's merely worth 500 when sold as a slave. Nimkar b'chayz v'nimkar, and it seems from the way Rashi learns the Gemara that this shita now is in dispute with the previous brisa, because here we learn that you can resell the Eved once and again, until you receive proper compensation. So if he stole 1,000, he's only worth 500. You sell him and sell him until you get the full amount. Nimkar b'chayz v'nimkar. What about Gneve Chamish Me'os? He only stole 500. V'shava elef, and he's worth way more. He's worth 1,000. Eino nimkar klal. This fellow cannot be sold at all. So basically, you can't say, look, I'll sell him for only 3 years. It's either all 6 or nothing. Rabbi Lezer Eimer, well, I'll take it a step further. Just like you can't sell him for half the time. Basically, you can make a half term Eved. Likewise, says Rabbi Lezer in the first case as well. Rabbi Lezer Eimer, the only time you sell him is if the amount that he stole corresponds perfectly, matches perfectly with the sale price. Then you sell him. But otherwise, if they're a bit off, Eino nimkar. So we're sort of ruling out that first example where he stole 1,000 and he's only worth 500. You can't do repetitive sales because that's the idea. It has to be an exact match. Amar Rava Baha Zakinu Rab Lezer Rabbanon. Using the following argument, Rabbi Lezer challenged the Rabbanon. What does he mean? The Maishno, how you differentiated between the first and second cases. The Maishno Gnevi Chamish Meis B'Shava Elef. Why is it so that in the case where he stole 500 and he's worth 1,000, Dein Nimkar, even you agree that he's not sold in this case. Nimkar Kulei Amrachmana V'Lechetz. Torah says it needs to be a complete proper sale for a full term. You can't just sell half of him, meaning half sale, a half term eved. So you agree with me on that. It's either all or nothing. Hachanami. Same in the second case. Same thing in the first case, right? Just like you agree with me that in case number 2, you can't sell him for half the term. Likewise, in the first case where he stole 1,000 and he's only worth 500, you say do repetitive sales. No. The point is that the sale money received on behalf of that sale will now on account of that sale will now be used to repay the victim completely and totally. It's meant to compensate for that loss. So you can't sell him knowing that you're only getting half that amount at a time. It doesn't work. It needs to be tit for tat. Okay, so this is another element found in the Amma. We do it against his will. We redeem her against his will. Now, what does that mean? That we force the master to cooperate, to let her go by way of redemption. Now, Abai responds to Rav. But this only applies to the Amma, right? It does not apply to the Eved. Now, Abai is assuming, so explains the Ritva, that if there is money available for this redemption, the Eved has some money for his bailing out. Well, it doesn't matter whether she's an Amma or he's an Eved. Giro and Kesef, right? Those are psukim that they can bail themselves out. It's not. We don't need the master's cooperation. We don't need his consent. So apparently, we're speaking. There is no money available. And that type of setting, we say, well, she can force her way out and he can't. How exactly is she doing that? Against his will. Amali Abai. My niyu. What happened here? The kasavna leishtora admei. That, maybe she's writing an IOU. Shtar, in lieu of that payment. So the Amma can do that and the Eved can't. How can she force him to go along with that? I mean, if he's happy with it, fine, but how can you force him? If you're not actually paying him, the balance. Imagine a person's holding a jewel. We're giving him a piece of pottery instead. He has a slave, a maidservant. How can you force him to accept a paper and let her go? The Brisa says we do it against his will. Against whose will? The father's will. Basically, if we discover that he has funds available to redeem his daughter, we force him to do so. Why? Otherwise, it puts the family in a bad light. One of their members are enslaved. So, if he's destitute, if he sells her out of desperation, which is typically the reason why he would sell his daughter, why else would he sell her? But if he's able to redeem her, we force him to do so. Asks the Gemara Yihachi, if that's the consideration that we're dealing with, Eved Ivri Nami. Same applies to an Eved Ivri. Nikfinu livnei mishpacha. Let's force the family members who have the ability, the wherewithal to redeem him, to do so. Mishum p'gam mishpacha. To protect the honor of the family. It's embarrassing to have a relative in such a situation. Says the Gemara, no. There it's different. Hadar, Azul, Umazbin, Nafshe. If we force the relatives to do so, there's always a concern that they're really enabling his habit. He might rely on them next time to bail him out. So we can't institute that obligation. Hachanami. If that's the concern, then here as well by the Amma Hadar Azin Umaz bin Law. What's the point in forcing him to redeem her? Well, tomorrow turn around and sell her again. Says the Gemara, no. Hoktani einanim keres v'nishnis. We have the halacha in this brisa that once he sells her, he can't sell her again. It's a one-time privilege. So once he takes her back, it's over. Umani. Now, who's the author of this brisa that you can't do a resell? Reb Shimon. It's Reb Shimon who says that it's a one-time deal. Reb Shimon desani meicher adam as bitel ishus v'shayne. One can, meicher means, it's just figuratively, means gives her away for isha, meaning he can be kaddish his young daughter, he can accept kiddushin on her behalf, can marry her off basically. And if something happens, she comes back home, v'shayne, he can do so again. There's no limit to the amount of times you can be mekadosh your daughter. L'shivchas v'shayne. Same if he sells her as a slave. He can do so once, he can do so again. L'ishuras achar shivchas. He can sell her as a slave, and then she comes back home, he can be mekadosh her as a wife. Avaloi l'shivchas achar ishus. But once she tasted marriage, she was already in a skadish, and it fell apart, she came back home, father cannot now sell her as a slave. That doesn't work. So according to Tanna Kama, the only restriction is that following ishus, you can't sell her as a slave. Reb Shimon Omer, he says, everything here is a one-time privilege. Right, regarding selling, it's only a one-time privilege. Just like you can't sell her once she tasted marriage. Once you sold her as a shivcha once, it fell apart, you can't sell her again. And that corresponds with the previous brisa, as we explained. This machlokes, this discussion between Tanna Kama, who says you can sell her as a shivcha once and then again later, and Reb Shimon who says you can't, revolves around the same drashos and psukim as we find in the following brisa, the machlokes between other shites, Reb Lezer and Reb Akiva, the Sanya. Pasuk says, once she's been redeemed, la'am nachri lo yimshol l'machra bevigdoi ba. So you can't sell her once he did something called bevigdoi ba. Now what does that mean? So according to Rabbi Akiva, bevigdoi is a lashon of beged, a garment. It's a figurative term. Kivan shepiris talisa aleh. Once the master spread his wings over her, so to speak, he brought her into his family. He took her under his auspices. He married her, basically. Even if it falls apart, she goes back home, father can no longer sell her again. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you can't sell her. L'shivcha achar ishus. So basically, Rabbi Akiva follows the shita of the Tanna Kama mentioned earlier. The only restriction is from selling her as a shivcha post ishus. So you can't do shivchos achar ishus. Okay, once she experienced marriage, father cannot go ahead and resell her now as a slave. Rabbi Lezer, no. Bevagdoi. Instead of bevigdoi, a lashon of beged, he learns bagdoi ba. Even though we read it bigdoi, but we focus on the spelling, and we read it as though it doesn't have that yud between the vase and the gimel. Bevigdoi, we read it bevagdoi ba. Kivan shebagad ba. Bagad means he rebelled, he rejected, he acted as a traitor to his own daughter by selling her. Once he does it once, he can't do it again. Shuv ein rashai l'meichra. So doing shivchas achar ishus is not a problem, but shivchas achar shivchas, that's a problem. What's machlokes about? Rav Lezer savar yeshem l'meseiras. Rabbi Akiva savar yeshem l'mikra. Very often we have a discrepancy between the actual spelling and the way we actually read it. So meseiras is a reference to the lettering, the spelling, which can be understood one way. Yesh aim is the mother. Tiras imecha, aim is typically a reference to Torah Sheba'al Peh, which expounds upon the Torah Sheba'Ksav, which is considered like the Av, like the father, the source of the Chachmas Hashem. Aim is the expansion, the elaboration. So basically, what's the focus on when we learn Torah Sheba'al Peh, when we derive the Rashas? Is it a focus on the Meseiros and the actual spelling and wording? That's Rabbi Lezer's approach. We don't focus on the way we read it when there's a discrepancy between the two things. And here, it doesn't have the yud in it. So in terms of its spelling, it's more in line with vagad. And therefore he concludes as such. Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva says Yeshem Lemikra, we focus on the actual enunciation of the word. Bevigdeba. That's the way we read it. So it alludes to a beged, indicating that once she was involved with a man as married, there's no longer the option of selling her as a slave. So basically, we have two shittas here. In terms of, term limitations on the father's side. Rabbi Akiva says, well, once he married her off, he was mekadesh her, he can no longer sell her as a slave. Rabbi Lezer says that's not an issue. The issue is selling her once and then again as a slave. And as we explained, that Rabbi Akiva is basically in line with the Tanakama that you can't do shifchos achar ishus. Reb Shimon Savar. Now we had Reb Shimon before, who basically limits everything. He says you can't do ishus and then shifchos. You can't do shifchos and then shifchos again. You know why? Because he combines both rashis. Reb Shimon Savar Yeshem LeMikra. He focuses on the mikra, on the way we read the word, which is Rabbi Akiva's approach. So once you had ishus, you can't follow that with shifchus. And Ula Maseris as well. He follows Rabbi Lezer as well. He reconciles Mikra and Maseris. You can say, look, you can have both Rashis, both interpretations. And therefore he adopts Rabbi Lezer's approach as well. You can't sell her and sell her again. And that's how he gets to his shita, that none of these can be repeated. Boy Rabba Baravu, Yud. So we know about Yud, which entails the Adain, the slave master, marrying the Amma. What status does Yud have? Yud Nisun Isa, it actually brings her into that second stage, fully married, or Eirusun Isa, or merely accomplishes an engagement phase, which needs to be followed by marriage. Nafkamina, what would be the difference? Liyarsha. Well, we want to know whether he's a full-fledged husband. If she passes away, does he get her inheritance? Let's say he's a kohen, can he tend to her kavura? Lafar and dareh, can he nullify her nadara, which are strictly marriage-related entities. Mai, so what is it? Does Yud make Ederson, or does it actually conclude the entire process, turns them into a married couple? Tashma, we'll try to bring a raya from the brisa we just mentioned. Big daiba, right? Kivan Shapir's Tadlise Aleh, Shuvei Nirashel Meichra. So once the master had taken her in, had done Yud, and let's say it didn't work out, she went back to her father, he can't now sell her as a slave again. Right? Okay. So clearly, he can't resell her. Yehudi miyaidla. But if he decides to marry her off, not in a maidservant context, Rashi says kolaymar the kiddushin. He's just going to accept kiddushin from a man to get her engaged. Father has the ability to administer that because she's still in his jurisdiction, right? She's still in his domain. She's still in the father's hands. What do you mean? She had experienced Yud. Vi Amris Nisuan Oise. If we'll say that Yud actually makes marriage, then the show's over. She's out of his hands. Her father can't control her destiny at this point. Given the Nisus, we know that once a girl marries, even if she's underage, she's out of her father's hands. He can't control her life. He can't be involved in her kiddushin. That proves our point that Yud has limited reach. So even though there was a Yud done, but that only makes Erusin. And if somehow that didn't work out and she's back home, her father's still in charge. Amar of Nachmar Yitzchak, no. Hacha b'kedushin da almakoi. Perhaps the Brisa is not even discussing a previous Yiyud. We're speaking that the father took his young daughter and he engaged her to a man. Not in a Amma ha'ivriya, shifcha, maidservant setting. V'chika Amar, kivan shemastra avia limi, shenaschai v'she'era, ksusa v'inasa. Once he handed her to this man, future, potential husband, got her engaged to this man who is being mekadesh her with the intent of marrying her. and obligate himself in all marriage-related obligations, she'er, ksusa, v'nasa, feed her, clothe her, be with her, shuv einach l'meicher. So once that happens, even if it fell apart and she's back home, he can't now decide to sell her as a slave, as we explained before, because you can't do shifchos achar ishus. We're not speaking about a situation of yud being done, and therefore has no impact on our discussion. Tashma, here comes another raya from another brayso. Ein moichro lekroiv. Father cannot sell his daughter to a relative who cannot potentially carry out yud with her. So even though he's selling her as a slave, but the shifchos, sale, must contain within it the potential for the eventual marriage with the owner. It's a precondition for selling the amma. He holds that it's not a precondition. If it's there, fine, but otherwise it doesn't hold back the sale. Vishav. Now all opinions agree that the father can sell her as a shifcha, even though she's an almana, a widow. His young daughter is already a widow. He wants to sell her to a kohen gadol. A kohen gadol, he can do that. Or if she's a grusha, a chalutza, she's divorcee, or she had chalitza done to her, he can sell her as a maidservant, l'kohen hedi, to an ordinary kohen, even though they are not really meant to marry her. So, realistically, yiyud is not an option, but as Rashi explains, kiddushin is teifes with these individuals, even though you're not meant to marry. Right? Almana is not meant to marry a kohen gadol, but technically speaking, if he is mekadosh, it works. So theoretically, there is a potential for yiyud, and therefore the sale is on. Now, let's focus on one of these cases. He's selling his daughter, who is already an almana. He's selling her to a kohen gadol as a maidservant. How did a ketana turn into almana? What exactly happened? Hi almana yechida. What are we speaking about? The kaddish nafsha. She herself got herself engaged on her own, and then her chassan passed away. Almana karila. Why would she be considered almana? A ketana who engages herself is, the kiddushin is worthless. Ve'ela de kacha avia. Apparently, her father accepted kiddushin on her behalf, and then this fiance passed away, and therefore she's an almana. And the brayso tells you, look, despite the fact that she's an almana, not really eligible to marry a kohen gadol, but he can sell her to the kohen gadol nevertheless. What do you mean? Mi matzi ma'azbila. What business does the father have selling her at all at this point? She had already experienced marriage. We just learned before that, at least according to Rabbi Kiva, who we assume, we paskin like, right? You cannot, once he got her engaged, she was involved with this man, you can't now go and sell her as a slave. V'amar of Amram, Amar v'Yitzchak. The answer is like this: Hacha b'kedusha yiyud, v'aliba to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. What happened was like this: he sold her once as a slave. The owner decided to exercise his yiyud option. Now, how does yiyud work? According to Rabbi Yehuda, he holds that it's not really the father's doing. He holds it's not like we look at the original money that the slave owner paid for her. We look at that money as kiddushin money, which is now being applied towards kiddushin. No, the original money, which was paid by the owner and received by the father, that's not the kiddushin money. That's not what makes it yiyud. Rather, as Rashi explains, he's using the outstanding balance of the amount of time which was not yet, which is still remaining on her balance sheet, meaning she worked only 3 years. So the leftover, the unworked years, so to speak, that's going to be applied to the kiddushin. He's sort of forgiving that and applying that credit to the kiddushin. So that's totally the master's doing. The father is uninvolved in this process. It's not like the father is now being mekadesher. If it's the original money that's being applied to the kiddushin, so you can say, well, it's the father's doing, because it's the money that he accepted originally, and now it's going to be applied for the Kiddushin, so he's involved in this process. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not so. It's totally the master's concoction. Right? So that's what happened to her. She had Yiyud, and for something happened, things fell apart, she came back home. She's an almana, right? This fellow died, okay, an almana. And Bryce is telling you that he can sell her again. This time to a Kohen Gadol, as we explained. Now, what pertains to our discussion is like this. Let's analyze this a bit further. So you're telling me she had Yud, right? Now, if Yud accomplishes marriage, it takes her all the way to the finish line. We know that once a girl gets married, she's out of her father's hands. So what's he doing selling her again? Oh, so you want to prove from here that it only makes Erusin. So she's still in his control. Right? Wrong. But the Brisa continues. Now, the father can sell her. What do you mean? How could he sell her? So she had Yud. And then he passed away. She's back home. You're telling me, okay, technically a father's still control because she never reached the finish line. Yud only makes Erusin. But there's another problem. There's another thing blocking the father, because once she had Ishus, he can't sell her for Shifchas Achar Ishus. In any case, he can't be selling her, if that's the case. Oh, so it must be that we're going to present some sort of distinction here. There's a difference between this type of sort of engagement to this man through the Yiyud, which isn't really the father's doing, as we explained. So here we don't hold him accountable. We don't hold it against the father. He doesn't lose his rights. He can still sell her as a shikha because he wasn't the one who engaged her. So we're going to differentiate between this type of engagement and your typical engagement where father is involved, which sort of cuts off his control and doesn't allow him to sell her afterwards. Shani Erusin Dida. There's a difference between Erusin, which was her doing, her and the master, Erusin Davia, as opposed to Erusin, which a father was involved with, which preempts any further sale. Here it's different. He wasn't involved. It was Yud, which is not the father's doing. So therefore, it doesn't preempt his further rights regarding selling her. Right? So it must be that we have to, present that distinction, right? So now, let's go back a second. So perhaps, you're working with the notion that Yud only accomplishes Erusin, otherwise this whole, system doesn't work. No, maybe Yud can take her to the finish line. The Yud that happened first time around made her a full-fledged married woman, a Nesuin Isa. Now, your question on that was, well, once she's married, she's out of the father's control. So what's he doing being involved? No, we'll make that same distinction that you just made a minute ago. There are different types of marriages. A marriage where the father was involved, which makes him lose control, as opposed to Yud, which is a sort of marriage which he's not involved in, which doesn't make him lose control over her. Shani Nesuin Didam, Nesuin Dideh, Lavia. Big difference between her marriage and his marriage. Meaning a marriage that he facilitated, which he didn't do this time. So perhaps he can still control her and sell her again. Says in 1 second. No. You can't compare these two things. It's apples and oranges. Hi Mai, what kind of matchup is that? Bishlei Me'erusin Shani. It certainly makes perfect sense to draw that line between an engagement process that father was involved, as opposed to one where father was not involved. One goes on his record, one doesn't. Bishlei Me'erusin Shani. Big difference. Ela Nesuin Mishani. But when it comes to the other concept, that Nesuin extracts her from her father's jurisdiction, once she's married, she's out for good. It makes no difference as to the circumstances of what led to the marriage. Was he involved? Was he not involved? She's out. She's gone. You see, by Erusin, the point of the Torah allows him one thing. You can only sell her once. You can get her engaged and sell her afterwards. So if he was the one who facilitated that engagement, okay, so his credit's over. But in Yud, where he's not involved, we don't hold him accountable. It doesn't go on his record. He doesn't, sort of use up his points. That's one concept. But Nesuin is a totally different track. which basically says once she's out of his house, she's gone, irrespective of the circumstances behind her marriage. So this substantiates our approach to the Brisa. It must be speaking. There was no Nisurin. So when the Brisa speaks about a father selling an almana l'kohen gadol, was speaking that she was merely misyaid. He had sold her as a slave, and she went through the yud process, which only accomplishes phase 1, engagement, right? And then the fellow passed away. She became an almana. She came back home, and since father was not involved in that engagement, because yud, as we explained, is totally, not his doing. So now he has the ability to now sell her. And he's trying to sell her to a kohen gadol. That's what the Brisa is speaking about. So bottom line is, we have proven that Yud only makes Erusin and not more than that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be involved in her life anymore. Asks the Gemara, one second. According to his approach, who says, he has a different approach in Rabbi Yossi. He says that, Yud works because the initial sale price, the money that you give to the father on account of this shifcha, is now going to be reapplied for kiddushin. That's how Yud works. So basically, father is involved, right? He was a facilitator of that whole process. He accepted the money. So now we're stuck. But my mukim. So what's the Brisa speaking about? How can now father try to sell her again once he was involved in getting her married through the Yud process, which was his doing in that initial sale? The answer is mukim lo Rabbi Lezer. Oh, so apparently, we have no choice. We have to say this Brisa is following Rabbi Lezer's shita. Rashi says typically we try to avoid that because we don't pass like Rabbi Lezer. The Amar l'shivchus achashivchus loymatzi mazbin. He holds that, you can't sell her once as a shivcha and then sell her again for the same, purpose, as we explained before. But right, the shivchus achashivchus loymatzi mazbin. Aval l'shivchus achar ishus matzi mazbin. But if there was a kiddushin the first time around, and now he wants to sell as a shivcha, that's not a problem. Shivchas achar ishus is not an issue. So that's what the Brisa is speaking about. She had the yud, which is ishus, and now she's an almana. Father wants to sell her again. Brisa says he can sell her even to a kohen gadol. Okay, that concludes today's daf. Let's do a quick recap. The Brisa lists all the escape routes of the Eved, Shanim, Yovel, Misasa Adin, the Amma Ivriya. Well, it depends. If she had Yud, then the only way out is a get. Otherwise, she has all those plus additional ones as well, Simanin, and she has the advantage of Einanim Keres Finishnis, so you don't sell her twice, and Maftan Isa Bal Karchai. We force the father, if he's able to redeem her, we force him to do so. These are things which apply to the Shifcha and not to the Eved, as the Gemara explained. We had several shittas regarding selling the Eved, when we do, when we don't, in terms of how much compensation we're going to receive in exchange for his sale. We had 3 shittas regarding selling and reselling the Amma. We have a shitta which says you can't do shifchos achar ishus. We have a shitta which says you can't do only thing you can't do is shifchos achar shifchos. And Rav Shimon says all these cases are off limits. Not shifchos achar ishus, not shifchos achar shifchos. All these things are not available. Now we had an interesting shayla regarding Yud. We had 2 ways to understand Yud. Is it the original money that's being applied, or is it just the Adin on his own, applying the credit for the years that are still outstanding? 2 ways to look at Yud. Basically, does it involve the father? Does it not involve the father? And we wanted to know whether Yud makes Erusin or Nisuin. And we pretty much proved that it does merely Erusin. All the best to you, and Hatzlacha Rabbah.